Hey everyone, welcome to Figuring Out Fabric, where I ask dumb questions and you get smart answers. And I have two of my favorite guests. I've got my dog Tyson because he won't stop barking, but I've also got Ginger Grant. Ginger has been consulting, doing courses for LinkedIn. She did the keynote at Past Summit. Just brilliant individual, and I'm very excited to have her on to talk about lake houses versus warehouses in fabric.
Well, thanks a lot, Gene.
Yeah,
Always good to see you again. I know we run into each other on a number of different conferences.
yeah.
And
Decent amount.
one of the things that I did at Past Summit was actually talk about lake houses
Oh,
and
nice.
warehouses. So I'm all in on what the differences are and when they'd be good and not.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking to hear more because I'm starting to understand now. But when I was like a year ago trying to learn this stuff, it was really frustrating because I assumed, well, first let's back up a second. When you go to Fabric, they're getting rid of it, but you have personas.
Yeah.
And so if you're not used to that from Databricks, you're like, well, which persona am I? And so I assumed, oh, well, I want to do database stuff. So I want the data warehouse persona. So I want a data warehouse. And then you find out that there's not as many ways to get data in. You can't just upload it like you can a Lakehouse. But at least back then when I was looking into the documentation, everything was Lakehouse first. And it really felt like warehousing was kind of an afterthought. So, you know, at a high level, what are these things for? When do I want to use one or the other?
Well, at a high level, it depends a lot. Your selection is going to be dependent upon the way you're going to use your data once it's there
Okay.
and the way you're going to get the data there. Those two things. And, how many steps that you want your ETL process is gonna may drive whether or not you choose lake house or warehouse and or your end use of it could drive. Now, if you've got a lot of people that are doing a lot of ad hoc querying, you'll probably want a warehouse. But if the primary purpose of you creating the lake house is to create something that Power BI can use, that's not again, that's more of a execution plan, if you were, if we're talking SQL, that's common to it, right? You got your semantic model, it knows what the semantic model is doing. So even if you're
Right.
using direct lake, it knows how that all works. So, but if you were doing and I know that I've worked for a number of companies where the executives in like finance and the CEOs, they have people that answer the random questions that they have. And they do a lot with Excel, but they do a lot of random one-offs that
Yes.
involve some, like, bizarre SQL. They could very much benefit from a warehouse. But here's the thing, if you have a lake house, it's really easy to load data into a warehouse. The step for that is practically brain dead to do that. So if you decide you need one later on and you have a lake house because you decided you want to do all of your ETL inside of Spark, for example, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, there was an interesting setup that Catherine, I think she touched on the episode we recorded, but she definitely touched on it at Summit, where some of their customers, they would do the file section in the lake house as kind of your bronze, the delta tables as your silver, and then your gold is the warehouse. And I could see that making a lot of sense. I think one of my frustrations with Fabric is I use this analogy a lot now, but like, I'm sure you've seen the Titanic. Do you remember the scene where like all the cutlery's out and
Yeah.
this poor Irish guy's like, what do I do? Yeah, it's like we start from the outside and you work your way in. And I feel that way. I feel like Microsoft is giving me like a grapefruit spoon and a salad fork, and I don't know which one I want. And it's the documentation. I know they're trying their best, but it's frustrating because you have this giant table of comparisons and features. And, I'm dying for a video, and maybe I just have to make myself, where it's like, if you're doing these 10 things, do not use a lake house. Or if you're doing these 10 things, do not use a warehouse. But like where does it start to not not make sense anymore? You know?
Well, I really do agree with Catherine's thought that you don't even need to get to a warehouse until you are in, your
Right.
gold layer.
That makes sense to me.
So, if you do not even start one until you're at the end of your process. It should always be an end state. It should never be a working state. And I think a lot of the great usage for a lake house is the working state, right?
Yeah.
I look at a lake house, if you're talking about medallion architecture, your bronze layer, the lake house is the former operational data store. I know a
Right.
lot of people are familiar with that kind of architecture because that's where you put all the stuff. And that's great for lake house. But the real question is, do you ever need a warehouse? Because if you are coming from, say, Synapse, you're like, well, it must have warehouse. But it doesn't have the additional feature sets
Mm.
that lake house, that the difference between like your dedicated, coming again from Synapse, your dedicated pool versus warehouse, there was a giant feature set shift between those two. So you're
Yes.
like, well, then I have to do this. But if you're looking at like what I can do in a lake house versus what I can do in a warehouse, and you start like ticking off boxes, not a lot of difference. The SQL
Yeah, that
engine is the same.
that's one of the things that I like about Fabric compared to Synapse. Because when I tried to learn Synapse, it felt like someone was selling me like Azure Butter Knife and Azure Chainsaw, right? Where like serverless, little slow, but like super cheap, great for Power BI because you just load the data in nightly. Like who cares if it's slow? And then you had dedicated, where it was more like what you'd expect, but you're paying for it to be on all the time. And so it's like two utterly different use cases where at least with like the thing that excites me about Fabric is the storage layer is the same and it's consolidated and you can even do shortcuts and all that kind of stuff. And so we're just having slightly different compute layers. And I tell people, I feel like if Fabric had 5 more years to like bake, I don't even know if we would have the distinction. I feel like the feature sets would have aligned, but Microsoft's a company. They can't just work on something in secret for 5 or 6 years and then release it. Yeah.
Marcus doesn't let anybody do that anymore. One of the big differences between the two of them is yes, they're using the same underlying storage layer, but the architecture is different. Because if I'm creating a lake house and I want, let's just get basic here. I want a date table. I'm going to have a file, or a basic, since I'm using Delta, I will have a folder that will contain my
Yeah.
log and my Delta files. I will have files like, yeah, that one's date. And that one over there, that's my fax sales, or, just random examples. But if I'm looking at a warehouse, I can't do that. I can't, there's no like file that I can point to and say, this is where I have my sales data,
Oh,
because it
okay,
doesn't work
sure.
that way. And so that means that the management of the two of them is different. Like, for example, if you want to go back in Delta and you want to go back 30 days, Warehouse does that by default.
Hmm.
Lakehouse does 7.
Now is it auto vacuuming or no?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you change that number? Can you change the
You can change it, but by default, it's gonna do
Right, yeah, no,
it's
it
gonna
doesn't
do
help
7
you
or
if, like, you're trying to do a
yeah.
retro and you're like, "Oh, it's gone."
Yeah,
Well, and
exactly.
it's frustrating too because, I mean, maybe I'm just naive, but I was trying to do some research on SQL tracing because eventually I wanna do a course on performance tuning SQL for Power BI. And you think, "Oh, well, this is T-SQL, the SQL Analytics Endpoint T-SQL, Warehouse T-SQL. Surely I've got the management features I'm used to as a DBA. I've got query store, extended events, execution plans." It's like, none of that. You get DMVs, Gruel, and Query Insights, and you're gonna like it. And even then, like, the thing I'm starting to understand is, like you said, totally different engines. So if you really do want access to internals, if Microsoft deigns to provide that, well, for one, you've got a Spark engine, the other, you've got the Polaris engine. And yeah, it's just like trying to compare Oracle and Postgres or
Yeah.
SQL Server and Postgres, like totally different engines, even if it's a similar structure. So
And yeah, I'm glad you didn't ask that, because the next thing that Microsoft is throwing in, and the answer to this question is so new that I can't really tell you the reasons, is
of course.
SQLDB. Putting SQLDB inside of Fabric as well.
Yes.
And the
Yeah, I mean,
reason that I can't really tell you how that is going to compare with Lakehouse and Warehouse is there's no pricing information. So this is all academic if we don't know how much it costs, right?
yeah, I mean, I think we'll at least have CUs. So I don't know.
It's not been announced though, so I
Oh,
mean,
fair. Okay. Yeah, I was
anything
thinking about
that
doing some
you
benchmarking on that at some point because
yeah,
there's been a
but
lot of conversation where like if your end goal is Power BI, in a lot of cases, you're way off better with a SQL DB than a Lakehouse. Because if you're just doing import, if you're pulling everything in, why do you need it to be column compressed if you're just bringing it back in and over the wire, it's going over TDS format, if it's going over SQL, you know what I mean? Like, but who knows until you benchmark it.
Well, I do think also, like, for example, it's going to be easier. This gets back into what lakehouse or warehouse. Your data transformation process is still going to be easier to a lakehouse than it is going to be to an Azure SQL DB.
Now, is I agree. Now, is that just because you have more tools available? Is it because you have better primitives and the fact you can actually just play around with the raw files instead of being constrained to T-SQL? Or like, why is that easier?
Why is it easier? Because because the underlying structure of a lakehouse is your Delta file structure. Once you've written that, you're
Right.
done.
You've got direct access. You
You
can,
got
yeah,
direct access to the file. So you write a file, you're done. With both SQL DB and warehouse, you're not done. When you have your I've gotten my Delta file created in Spark, you have there's other steps that you have to do.
right.
So
No, that
that's
makes sense.
yeah. So the ETL thing is going to be the same between the two of them in terms of, if is Lakehouse still going to be easier because just less steps. Oh
Yeah, and like I said, when I was learning some of this stuff, I really got the impression that like it is Lake House first. It really feels like Microsoft, and this isn't secret information. This is just me BSing, to be clear, not violating any NDAs. But it really seems like they saw what Databricks was doing and they're like, we want that. But then they already had this engine and they had things they wanted to support that you can't easily do in a lake house. To my understanding, you can't do writes, although I don't agree that you should be using SQL to write stuff in if it's supposed to be an analytics database.
yes, yes,
You
exactly.
can't do multi-table transactions. There's some security stuff from my understanding. And it really felt like they were like, okay, what we really want is just everybody using lake houses, but we've got some stuff we need to support, so we're going to give you two options. Is kind of as a layperson what it feels like from the outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree because like here's the thing. As a somebody who does we'll call it data engineering because that's a new trendy
Yeah.
term now. But once I've got my model created, I don't want you touching it. And that
Yeah.
means I don't want you to be able to go into my data store, aka the warehouse, and say, "Oh yeah, we need another column over here." No, because
Yeah.
that should be part of the entire data flow process. And you're like, "Yeah, I'm just adding a column here because I want one." That
Yeah.
it's
Why?
like, why that's kinda like a tack on at the end, and I think that that could screw up with you do have too much, messing with it. You're not really designing, you're just kinda,
Yeah, you're not
bolting
architecting,
things
you're not
on.
engineering. It's the bike shed problem, right? You've
Yes.
paid these professionals to make a beautiful house, and then your Uncle Bob's like, "Well, I'm gonna throw on a bike shed." And you're like, "That doesn't seem structurally sound, but okay."
Yeah.
Um,
I'm just gonna
yeah,
plug this electrical
and
right here. It'll work. Yeah.
well, and I think it misleads people as the purpose of the data warehouse, and the name does too. Like, honestly, I know it's not good marketing, but if they just called it Lake House with transactional and T-SQL support, I'd be so much happier, right? But they didn't. It's a different engine, I get it. But, when I was first looking into it, I thought, "Oh, this is your traditional, like, not even OLAP, but basically star schema-shaped SQL server kinda thing." That's what I assumed. And then you find out, like, no, 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 no. Like, if you knew about Synapse, I would understand this better. But, like, no, this is our MPP separation from cloud and compute, like, it's its own beast. And it's just so silly to be treating it like an OLTP system by allowing you to do writes into it. And if it's Delta, you're gonna get, I don't know, I assume you're gonna get the small file problem. If someone's inserting 100 rows, that's gotta be a tiny file, and at some point you run optimize, but it's just an anti-pattern. I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too is I had a client recently
Mm,
and, we were architecting a solution for them in Fabric. And I said, "All right, what is your" trying to figure out again at the end state, 'cause we're not gonna talk earlier because I'm doing Lakehouse too for my development, but when we're done, what do you want? Lakehouse or warehouse? And they said, well, we need a lake house because our users need to write tables. And I said, why on earth do your users need to write tables?
Yeah.
And come to find out, it's because of some Excel thing they're doing. And that's how they know how to do it. But I'm like, why do we have, well, why would your end users need to write tables? Why? Because it doesn't make any sense to me. They would need to do that. But yes,
Yeah.
so they can continue doing the thing that they've always done because that's really what they want to do.
Well, and that's part of the challenge of the Big Ten approach with fabric. Like, it's not, this isn't a criticism, but this is going to be a heavy lift for everyone.
Yeah.
Organizations, Microsoft, educators. We, not we, Microsoft has decided that we're going to have a big family Thanksgiving, and the data scientists and the data engineers and the business users and Chris in accounting are all going to sit at the same table. And there's a lot of governance that goes into that because they really are trying to get the Excel users in Fabric. I mean, I'm excited about it on some level. The fact that you've got
Always.
data flow so you can use Power Query, you've got Visual SQL, like, it's a moonshot, but I think they might land on the moon. But until they do, like, we're gonna have a Houston, we have a problem kind of issue from it's gonna be a nightmare. It just
Well,
is.
I can tell you is another thing that my clients have mentioned, and I don't know what the answer this is, but I'm going to go back to my little Synapse story again. In Synapse, if you were inside of your warehouse, they realize that all queries are not of equal importance, and you could
Mm,
prioritize groups of users. So, like the users you really cared about, they had high priority, and like stupid stuff, low priority.
sure, yeah.
Well, inside of Fabric, my dev Lakehouse that I'm playing around with because I want to see what I'm doing, and my production Lakehouse, same priority, and they do not have the same priority.
It's so bad. Like,
Yeah.
I only know this secondhand. I haven't had to deal with it personally because I just deal with tiny little businesses that are just asking about Fabric. But I talk to people, and the idea that some schmuck with a rogue Spark notebook might be able to take down your F64 capacity because they're still working on the surge protection that they announced at Ignite that they're working on. Like, it's just bananas and pajamas. I just, and some people, the workaround is like, oh, well, we'll just buy different capacities. And it's like, you have a lot of
Mm.
money. I don't,
Yeah,
right?
but even different capacities, I mean, so you have the same problem at a different scale, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because, like,
Your self-service users aren't taking things down, but Brian, the data engineer who doesn't understand exactly what he's doing can still just blow out your budget in terms of CUs.
I can tell you this, I was teaching a class at a client, and I was doing Spark inside of Fabric, and we impacted dev. And dev impacted us at different times. I mean, we
Yeah,
we
sure.
clock we clocked the CUs on it and in class. And it was an F64, but man, and I don't know what dev was doing because again, as a consultant, you don't always have access to every single
Yeah,
part of
exactly.
the administrative part. But I can tell you this: we impacted them and they impacted us.
Yeah.
So, and this is a training class, so
Yeah.
not cool.
Yeah, right. It's not even production workload. But it's important still because they're paying a lot of money for you to be there. Like,
Yeah.
I did a training class for a customer, and I ate a lot of sushi in the evenings. And I get the expenses went through. I got approved. Wonderful. I
Wasn't
think
gas
because
station, and you're still here.
yeah. But like, this stuff is important.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I guess I a related kind of question. So we've talked about how, like, it's a lot to figure out and learn. I forget, have you done much training on, like, the DP600 or DP700, these certs that are coming out?
Um, I have I have done some, and I have signed up to do more, so there you
Yeah, yeah,
go.
yeah. Oh, I'm
I'm actually
yeah, yeah.
I'm actually teaching DP600 for a provider that I generally do called, Interface Technical Training, and I do one every couple of months, and I'm doing one the 3rd week of January, I believe.
Okay.
DP600.
Yeah, so my question is, for people that are feeling lost, do you feel like these certs might help? Because I know people are mixed on certs, but my opinion is if you have no idea where to start, it's someone's made a learning path for you. It's better than nothing.
So my thoughts on all certs are really important because they make you learn stuff.
Right.
And you always learn things that are not on the exam by accident. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the learning process. Is it's not like, yay, unless you do things that are not uh, sanctioned by Microsoft by just examining questions, but learning how
Yes.
to learning things that like because you thought that might be on the exam and turns out you're wrong, or you learn more. And the idea of learning more is never a bad thing. And things that make you learn, I'm all for, whether that be your company makes you take a class or you take a cert. Even if you never take the cert, if you studied for it, that's a win.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah, you don't necessarily need that piece of paper, just doing the process.
No.
Especially, it's a little bit more expensive with fabric, but if you can set up a home lab,
Yeah.
like, that's helped me as a student, but also as a consultant. Like, the number of times at my last job where I've got Hyper-V and I'm setting up mirroring between SQL Server because I have a customer job in a week, and I don't know how to do it, and I need to find the pain points because I'll tell you what, high availability for SQL Server, there's a lot of surprises
Oh, yeah.
that you like, having to understand Windows clustering, just awful.
Yeah.
And I ran into stuff with Fabric because I did a blog post. I have a weird concept of vacation. I'm on vacation for like 3 weeks, and for the first time in since college, I have this much time off, and I'm like, "I'm gonna do blogs and work on my next course." But I did a blog post on Fabric benchmarking, and there were just so many pain points, and a lot of it wasn't even Fabric. Like, I've never properly learned the difference between an access key and an SAS signature for blobs because I just haven't had
No.
to. So me trying to like understand all that or understand the difference between the blob URL and the like what is it? HDFS, like the ABSS, the data lake URL that you use, understanding all that data access stuff was such a pain.
Yeah.
And so you learn things that people don't talk about that is not in the documentation. And I
Well, I can
wish more
tell you
people would
this.
good.
Yeah, I know that I'm really looking forward to studying more. I have not taken DP 700
Yeah.
because if you look at that exam, there's a lot of stuff on streaming, and nobody has wanted to me to help them do any streaming, so I've not done any streaming. So I don't know a whole lot about streaming. So I'm not going to take that exam until I do. So me taking that exam will mean that I've learned a new skill, and that's all about how to do streaming in Fabric, which I will admit I don't know much about, but I will
Yeah.
because I'm going to take that exam.
There's like 4 or 5 different ways to get data into Kusto, just to warn you right now. Um, the next episode of the podcast, which I'm also recording today, will be with Frank Geisler? Oh, it's
Yeah, yeah,
German.
yeah. I love
Yeah.
Frank. He's a
Yeah,
great
so
guy.
we'll be talking about the real-time intelligence stuff. So maybe he can explain to me why we're doing real-time intelligence in a column store analytical environment. I know
Well,
it's not
yeah.
immediately backed by Parquet, but it's like, again, I worry about the small file problem or something, you know?
Yeah, it's just the fact that it's if you've ever worked on where you're doing I mean, I've done streaming, but it was, we're using, different technology to handle the streaming part of it, and that
Yeah.
gets complicated and can be expensive.
Yeah.
So the ability to make that in as part of I think that one of the things that Microsoft has really pushed inside of Fabric that a lot of people like is like people are tired of like I need an Azure bill for this and Azure bill for that, and that comes out to real money. I mean, Synapse was a definitely a part of that. I mean, I wasted $500 one weekend because I forgot to turn something off. So stuff like that happens. And the idea of containing all of that inside of Fabric, I think, appeals to a lot of people.
I I I think that's a huge selling point. Like, that's people get really down on Fabric, but coming
Yeah.
from the Power BI space, I see such a huge value add. Now, they have to catch up with the governance piece, like we
Yes.
talked about. Like, I've looked at the Fabric capacity monitoring report, and it is a good first start, but it can be challenging to drill down into, like, okay, why was that spike? Or it can be challenged, like, because I did the benchmarking, so I had to grab CUs. And because I didn't have a good way inside the report to do the splits that I wanted, I every single time I wanted to do a test, I made a new lakehouse with a different name. So I ran most of these tests 3 times, so like file upload or whatever. So I made 3 lakehouses by hand. I'm sure a notebook would have made my life easier. But if the reporting let me say, okay, what was the CUs for this day for this lake house,
Yeah.
I wouldn't need to do that. Um,
Well, one of the things that I found too is that, uh, and not enough people have access to that capacity app.
right.
Because, organizations look at that as an administrative feature. It's just an app. It's just read only. It's not gonna hurt
It's
to give
Power
it to
BI.
more
Yeah, no one's
people.
gonna die. Yeah,
Right, but they don't.
yeah.
And
Well,
as a result, a lot of people who could learn from what they're doing don't even know that that report exists because they don't have access to
yeah,
it.
you don't have that feedback loop, and
No.
depending on the tool you use, you can have a 10x difference in cost. Like I saw
Yeah, or
that
if, like,
where
if something crashes and you don't know why because you don't have access to the report.
yeah. 'Cause, I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it was like a 2x or 3x difference in efficiency between the most efficient option to get CSVs in, which is like easy copy, and then the least efficient, which was just file upload through the browser. And it's not like there's a little toast pop-up that says, "Hey, you're doing something expensive and dumb." You don't know until the situation you talked about where dev's mad because you're hogging all the capacity.
Yeah. Well, I will say though, if you're looking at ETL and what takes most resources, I'd like to give a shout out to Gilbert of his Four Moves
Mhm.
blog, fourmoves.com, and because he has some detailed statistics on which ETL processes are faster than others.
Oh,
And
okay.
one of the ones that I remember reading, and I go and I refer a lot of people to, is the fact that if you want to use traditional data factory data flows, it's 38% more efficient to use a notebook instead.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just all this little stuff that you don't necessarily know.
And
Um,
that gets into whether or not you want to use a lake house or a warehouse.
yeah. Well, I think we're coming up towards the end there, so I just had a couple wrap-up questions for you. This has been great. So what is your most favorite and your least favorite fabric feature?
I really like I like lake houses in the fact that if I want to load up a file right now and I want to start playing with it, no problem.
Yeah, you can
I
be
can
you
just
can be
load
ready
up
in a
my
minute.
files, bam, bam, yeah. That I love that. That is makes things so much faster. I mean, yes, if I'm gonna do it for reals, I know I can do a whole ETL process. But I'm like, I just want to try something quick, and I can do that. It makes it super easy. The thing that I like the least, is that what your other question?
Yes.
So that what I like about the least is the DevOps and Dev pipelines integration.
Okay.
And the reason why is that, so if I have all of my stuff using source control and DevOps, great. Then I've got everything except for the things that aren't supported. I've got everything inside of source control. Okay. But if I want to move things from dev to test to prod, that's dev pipelines. Dev pipelines has nothing to do with DevOps. So
Oh,
how do I
okay.
know from a DevOps perspective if I moved from dev to test?
Yeah, it's man, I know you know this, but coming from the Power BI side, it's been a painful ride. It really feels like I get it. Back in 2015, they said we're gonna 2-week agile sprint our way until something someone will buy. So we're just gonna put it all in a big zip file. And
Yeah.
then, a decade later, a little bit less than that, they're like, "Oh, we wanna make an enterprise tool, and so we need to find how to retrofit source control into this." And I feel for the devs. I mean, I'm sure some of them came in long after, and it's not their fault, but that's hard. That's really, really hard to retro if you didn't design it from the beginning. And, the same thing with, like, the fabric innovation for integration from source control. As an outsider, you look at, like, what's still in public preview right now. Like, so many things are still in public preview, and it really feels like they had to just kind of figure out how to fit it in there and then smooth it out over time, and so right now it can be frustrating.
Yeah, and my clients, I have clients who's like, if it's not, I can't use that unless it's released.
Yeah.
So things like using PBIX files, because again, you have to have fabric capacity to be able to use DevOps inside. But if
Yes.
you want to use just the um, PBIP files and desktop, oh, that can't do that because it's not GA.
Yeah, yeah, and, like,
Yeah.
you could use deployment pipelines, but you're not getting any source control, and you still need premium. So you don't need Fabric, but you s
Yeah.
like, so There's no just like it just works. There's no Apple like just do it kind of thing.
No.
You're either paying or it's still in public preview, and so yeah, no, that's
I
rough.
know, and if you got clients like, "Nope, can't do it, not released," and I
Yeah,
get their point,
yeah.
but I'm also annoyed.
There's way too many social media networks. So where can people find you? And is there anything you want to promote? You said you were doing some classes and stuff.
Yeah, I'm old school and lazy, so I only am on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And on LinkedIn, I have 2 classes in fabric. My last class was advanced fabric, where I go through a lot of different elements, and I'm working on another class in LinkedIn. So especially if your organization pays for you to do LinkedIn learning classes, check out my courses that I have there.
Yeah, I found those personally helpful, especially
Thank
when I
you.
had to do a training in Philadelphia and the first day was on fabric and I didn't know fabric, just because at least like you touch on some of the edge cases or some of the variability, all this kind of stuff. Like it doesn't when you teach, it doesn't feel like you're just reading off the docs. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, oh, one other thing I wanna I'm so
Yeah.
excited that I got
Yes.
picked to do a, fabric workshop at Fabric Summit in Vegas, and I will be
Oh,
talking
that's
all
right.
about Lakehouse.
I'm very
Yes,
I'm very excited for you.
yes.
I'm like 5% jealous. Like on my bucket list is I want to do like a pre-con and an international conference. Like one of these days, you know.
Well,
But
Vegas
you
is
know, it's
still
pretty
US,
competitive.
so
So
it's not a foreign country,
yeah. Yeah.
but
I'm
there's
probably
always
gonna
single bits.
no Bits is doing invites only for that. But yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Well,
data
this has
selling.
been awesome. So thank you very much. And thank you
Alright,
for talking about fabric.